All right, this is part 2 of week 13. We're going to do this recap quiz from last week on classes and objects. If you just missed the recap video, it's a 9-minute video that I just recorded before this one. But we're going to jump into this test. It's got a time limit of 30 minutes, but that should be more than enough because it's only 8 questions. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. The password is all lowercase, no spaces, final weekly test. And there we go. So, question 1. A class is, and I'll zoom in so you guys can see this better in the recording after. A class is blank. A pointer to a method, also known as an object, a special variable, or a user-defined data type. What do we think? Any thoughts on this? We were talking about template, right? We were talking about how a class is a blueprint or a template for objects. We know it's not a pointer, right? We can make pointers of objects. A class we know is also not known as an object because objects and classes are different things, right? Yeah, okay, perfect. You guys got it. A user-defined data type. Yeah, exactly. We define it, we create it, and so it's a user-defined data type. Perfect. Nice. Question 2. The blank of a class is used to initialize objects of that class type. The destructor of a class is used to initialize, the assignment operator, the initializer, or the constructor. Yeah, we just covered this, so you guys got it. Constructor, pretty straightforward. I thought I could trick you with the initializer one there, but. Question 3, class member attributes can be accessed with the blank operator, the extraction, size of, insertion, or dot operator. So this is when you've created an object or an instance of a class and you want to do like this blank name and access the name member attribute. Oh, perfect. You guys got it. It's the dot operator. Yeah, you do like this dot name or like my object name dot member attribute. Yeah, nice. Dot operator. Question 4. If no user-defined constructors are provided for a class, C++ will automatically generate a blank constructor. And we just talked about this morning. Nice, you got it. Perfect. So it's not global, it's not useful, default or local. Well, you guys are saying default. I believe you. It is the default constructor. But if we do declare, right, if we do declare a constructor, then the default constructor is not created by default anymore. It's we have to make it explicitly on our own. Okay, question 5. Blank and blank determine the access allowed to class members. So remember we talked about this a little bit. The access modifiers. We've got public, private, open, closed, new, delete, viewable, and non-viewable. Public and private seems to be the one that everyone's saying in the chat. Very good. Protected is one, but we're not covering it really in this course. Yeah, so it could be public, private, protected, yeah. For now, you can just think of protected being the same as private because it kind of goes outside of the scope of everything that we're covering in this course. We won't actually have a use for protected variables. Question 6. The class blank is called when an object goes out of scope. The class destructor, the class deconstructor, the class destroyer, or the class deleter. They all start with D. They're all very similar. Detonator. Detonator is another good option that I should add. The destructor. Very nice. Yeah, you guys got it. Sometimes by accident, I notice I've been saying deconstructor, and that's actually very bad of me to say that because I could have tricked you here. Yep, the class destructor, you got it. Okay, we've got a screenshot of some code. What does the following code here display? So we've got a class definition, and then we've got our main function that creates an object of that class. So the class is called test. It's got some private variables num and increment num, which is a private function that just does num plus plus. And then it's got a public function here, num int num num. Okay. So actually public, yeah, function that takes in a number and then it initializes the number to that number. So this is another way of, I didn't show you guys this yet, but this is another way of initializing a variable in a class. Instead of doing it in the curly braces, you can just put a colon. But you can do it the same way you've done it before. It's fine. Okay, and then we've got our main. So here we created our object out of our test, and we pass it initialized value of 100. Okay, so that's what this is doing here. It's going to set 100 to num. And then on this line, we see out with our extraction or insertion operator, sorry, object.increment underscore num end line, and then we return 0. And object.increment num is this function here, which does num plus plus. So what would this put out? Would this put out 100, which is the default value? Would it print out 101 because it does plus plus? Would it print out garbage data because something wasn't initialized correctly? Or would it not compile? And what I want you to focus on here specifically, okay, we've got a vote for 101. What I want you to focus on specifically here is the function that it's calling from main. Okay, so one person said 101, one person said the code won't compile. Why won't the code compile, Simon? Why do you think that? Default constructor takes no args.
Can I hear? I see object, but I didn't see constructor here actually, so it's still not working.
Yeah, there's no constructor, but this isn't calling a constructor here. Oh, I see what you're saying. So because there's no constructor defined at all, then actually what will happen is C++ will generate the default constructor, which will actually set it. Sorry,
I
this
didn't
is the
see it
constructor
here
here.
actually. Where is?
This is the constructor here. Test.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. So I spoke incorrectly. This here under public is the constructor for test, the test class. We can see it has the same name, and it takes in a number. And then, like I said, this is just a new way that I didn't show you. It's called list initialization, and it's a different way of initializing a variable in a constructor with a colon there, and then passing in the number that you want to initialize it to. So this would initialize it to 100. Yeah. Does that make sense? I think Simon it was. Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. We've got someone voting for 100. So they think it'll print out 100. Okay. And we've got someone voting for 101. All right. So what I want you to focus on here, guys, it's calling object.increment num. Okay. Increment num, if we look at it here, a void, so it returns void, increment num, num plus plus. But pay attention to what type of method increment num is. What's the access modifier on increment num? It's private. Very good. So because it's a private method and we're calling it outside of that scope, are we allowed to get access to private methods? Or will it fail to compile because we're trying to access a private method? Right. Nice. No, you got it. Okay. So that was kind of a tricky one. it won't compile because increment num is a private method, right? And because we're calling it out here, the only way to access private variables or private methods is through anything under the public access modifier here. Because there's no method to access increment num or num from the public access modifier, then the code won't compile. Does that make sense? Hopefully. It's a tricky one. If it doesn't make sense, thumbs down and I can explain again. Okay, thumbs up, sweet. Cool. All right, and question 8, the final question. Given the following class declaration, which statement is not true? Okay, so all of these statements are true except for one. So let's take a look at the class declaration. We've got a class of test again. We've got a private access modifier, int num, void increment num, num++, so that's the same as last time. And we know that that's private now. Now we've got a public access modifier, and here's our constructor that takes in the argument num and initializes it to num, whatever's passed in. And we also have a public access method called decrement num, which takes no arguments, but it does num minus minus. Okay? So, which one is not true? Num is not accessible outside the class declaration. The class has a default compiler-generated default constructor. The class has a default compiler-generated copy constructor. The decrement num is accessible outside the class declaration, or the class name is test. Okay, well, let's see what we can rule out here. Well, before I do it for you, what do you guys think? What do you think is not true? Okay, so we've got a vote for the class has a default compiler generated copy constructor, and we have a vote for the class has a default compiler generated default constructor. Okay, so we've got a couple votes for those ones. Okay, so that means we can rule out this last one, right? The class name is test. Well, yes, line 1, we know that's true. Okay, so that's not our answer. Decrement num is accessible outside the class declaration. Well, it's a public method, so we know that's true. So we can rule the last two out here. Num is not accessible outside the class declaration. Well, num is private, so yeah, it's not accessible. So we also know that that's a true statement. So it's one of these ones. Now, I didn't talk to you guys about copy constructors. But basically what copy constructor is it allows us to copy all of the attributes and properties of a constructor, kind of like inheritance, which you'll see later today, and then specialize it to be a different type of constructor. And then you don't have a bunch of duplicate code. All right, and the other option we have is a default compiler generated default constructor. Well, remember what I said earlier about default constructors are created when? A no args default constructor is created when?
When we not created constructor, but we did constructor here.
On line 8, we have a constructor. So the class has a default compiler generated default constructor. Well, that's actually false then, right? Because if we have a constructor here, all right, C++ will only generate a no args constructor like this if this line of code wasn't there. So therefore, saying that it has this default constructor is false. And we're looking for a statement that's false, right? So only one of these statements is false. That's got to be it. So it actually does have a default generated copy constructor. We're not going to worry about that because I didn't teach you guys about that. So yeah, it does not have a default compiler. It does not have a default constructor, but this statement saying that it does, which is why it's false. Does that make sense? I know it's a little bit wordy, but I think you got it, Milo, when you said it there. So yeah, perfect. Awesome. Okay, so you can submit that. Hit OK. And we took 15 out of 30 minutes, so we had more than enough time, and we got 80 out of 80. Very, very good. Great work, party. Party symbols. Oh, there we go. We can stop this video now.